everybody. I'm Matt Valley. Welcome to episode number 125 of the Rock and Roll Research Podcast, where we share the super cool backstories and side gigs of the research and insights pros that you trust. Well, today I've been looking forward to this episode for a long time. This is just one of those ones that just has to be. So I'm going to be talking to Graeme Ford here with me on the podcast. Graeme, this year just started a research agency in the UK called PunkMRX. Now that's where it's at, right? So that suggests to me that, hey, you're taking a different approach. You're thinking about things differently. You're blowing up the rule book, finding fresh new ways to win with customers, right? Sounds about right. Something like that. Punk ethos applied to research. Yeah.
100%.
Cool. So a couple things about Graeme that I think are really cool. First of all, he is quite literally a punk rock researcher in that he has done research on punk rock in academia, which is really cool. It's part of a master's degree that he did. So he's the expert. He's the one who knows. And another thing I find really interesting, so before PunkMRX, he was at YouGov. Now, he was at YouGov before for a few years, left to start a company, and then boomeranged back when YouGov bought his company. So kind of a neat story there. So we're going to talk about all that and more on today's podcast. Welcome to the show, Graeme.
Hey, Matt, thanks a lot. It's an honor to be here, and thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. I have to say we've got my good buddy Lenny Murphy to thank for facilitating the connection. So thanks so much for that, Lenny. I just knew, like, he turned me on to PunkMRX and what we were doing. I was like, I gotta talk to this guy. And I loved our first chat, so I've been looking forward to this for some time. So that's really cool. So
Likewise.
yeah, for sure. One other thing. So if I think about punk rock, I think about sponsorship. If anyone saw this Green Day Keurig machine, it was really super cringy. But nevertheless, I do have sponsors. Magic Mind right here. I'm going to say a couple words about it. If you've been watching the podcast for the last, I don't know, 8 or 10 episodes or so, you know I've been taking this productivity elixir, this enhancement, clears my mind, reduces procrastination, all that good stuff. So if this is something that is of interest to you, works for me, could work for you, go to magicmind.com/rock and roll. Use code rock and roll 20 for a nice discount. I'm going to go down the hatch, Graeme, and then we'll jump into it. All right. Cool. Graeme, punk rock, research. There's no better combination in my mind. So
Same for me.
So let's start on the research side. So how did you get into this crazy space in the first place? And tell us a little bit about the vision for PunkMRX.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I guess a lot of people who work in market research, when they're asked that question, they'll say that it's something they just fell into via
Right.
sort of like one avenue or the other. But I don't know if this is like a sad thing to say or not, but I sort of like knew in my late teens that this was the sort of like field I wanted to sort of like be in. I loved human geography at school. I love alternative geographies, like the study of people, society, what communities meant, what people were doing in different countries, and how all that sort of like mixed together. And then I remember when I went to go see my careers advisor at school, because you have to fill in this big questionnaire basically about things you like doing, things you don't like doing, and then you get a list of jobs that they think you should do. And mine came back as a naval architect. Now, I literally had no sort of like interest in that, so it's just a crazy idea that came out. But I sort of like knew I wanted to get in the research field in some way, or in the world of like sociology, anthropology, psychology, in whatever avenue. And I had a bit of an analytical like mind as well, so it just seemed like the perfect sort of like thing to sort of like get into. And like post school, that led me into sort of like human geography as a bachelor degree, and then sort of like sociology based stuff for an MA. But yeah, I mean, I've just always been interested in in people. I'm sort of like one of those classic people who go on holiday not to relax, but just to sit around and like people watch and just see all the sort of like different things that are going on. So from around 16, 17, it was something that I just knew I wanted to follow, and I had like a huge passion in music, and my like big goal was to try and get a big job at a music company doing sort of like market research there. So I think I just basically started out on that journey. I was like, okay, I've got to get to London, I've got to get my first job. Um, and luckily, I ended up working at Warner Music, and that was a great highlight, sort of like for me. So
Yeah.
had a great career, had a great career in market research, bounced around client side, agency side, different bits and pieces. But yeah, did my biggest stint and my greatest learnings at YouGov probably for about like 10 years. Sort of overall, met some like amazing people there, like learned from some like really sort of like good people. They really let me like grow into the role, allowed me to like innovate, do things differently, push different things like forward. So it was sort of like the perfect platform. Interestingly, I left YouGov to co-found a business with another ex-YouGover and a technology person, because it was at a time where we saw the intersection of like conversational tech becoming a lot more important, or something that we could see that was going to become a lot more important outside of standard point and click
Sure.
surveys. So then, interestingly, YouGov bought that company, so they came back into the fold, and I left there early this year, and I started PunkMRX. I had a different name, always had a different name for the company in the back of my mind, that I was sociography. It's basically like the study of people in places. And I got right to the last point, and I was like, oh, this just doesn't feel like me. I'm sort of, maybe I'm using this to sort of like please a group of people that might find it appealing. And right at the last minute, I changed it to PunkMRX, because usually if I'm out down the pub or down the bar, I'm only talking about punk, or I am then sort of like boring people about market research or trying to explain to them actually what I've been doing as a job for the last sort of like 20 years. But even after a couple of months out of YouGov, just taking some time to chill out and relax, um, even being disconnected for a couple of months, the industry just moves at the moment like so quick.
Yeah.
There's always something like different coming up. Something always gets like hyped up out of control, and sort of like people don't really. I get the feeling there's a lot of people that sort of like don't know how to sort of like keep up with it. When there's probably still people sort of trying to wrap their heads around the whole big data type of like hypes from sort of like years ago. So
Sure.
the concept around sort of like punk MRX was to more focus on the industry, what's happening within the industry, and what changes are going to sort of like happen in the future, to sort of like take sort of like brands and also like smaller mid-size agencies along the journey to help them sort of like navigate the changes that have happening now, but also the ones that need to be aware of in the future. Because even though I haven't been working in the industry a long time, the amount of the amount of like change is just insane. From when I think about the tools I was using 20 years ago to the
Yeah.
tools that are available today, I mean, it's people. Some people's minds must be blown around it. So yeah, at the moment I'm focusing helping with clients sort of like wrap their heads around how they can integrate AI into their service models, bring in sort of like more res tech to make their sort of like ops more efficient, by sort of like bringing down and sort of like adding a level of consultancy around as well. So
Sure.
been working with a few clients for the moment, which is good. Love to have more as sort of like time goes on, but yeah, just want to bring a bit of punk rock ethics to market research, to show people it's not afraid to be different. It's not afraid to do your own things. You can sort of like buck the trends of the norms, and don't be afraid about it. If like other people are doing this, doesn't mean you have to follow them. It doesn't necessarily mean that's where the money is. That's where the revenue is going to come from. And if you've got
Yeah.
good ideas and you can adapt them to what your core values are, then you can play in that space as well.
Yeah. And it's so interesting you're talking about how quickly the research and insights industry is changing. Having been in this space for a while myself, uh, years ago, the knock on the industry was that it was very slow moving, right? And it was always behind what was happening in, say, like marketing or whatever. And it's really changed. And I think years ago it was very dogmatic. So the idea of coming in with like a punk ethos, blowing things up and thinking totally differently about things, I think that there was probably less appetite for that years and years
Yeah,
ago. But it feels like the time is right.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I mean, I still see loads of posts on LinkedIn at the moment around how like we as an industry like still need to get better at educating other agencies and clients and like sort of like so forth. And sometimes I think that's an easy thing to say, but there needs to be people that are going to sort of like put themselves out there to like try and do something about it. Because I guess a lot of agencies or consultancies will be sort of like micro looking in at, I don't know, specific projects that a client is doing rather than sort of like how the industry and their competitors are potentially taking revenue away from them and then sort of like safeguarding them for the future. So fingers crossed that the time is now, and had a sort of like good chat with Lenny about this in terms of sort of getting a group of people together, like a tribe of people that like focus on the industry. And there's some like great people out there. And I know I'm new to that game, but hopefully I can make a difference and sort of like add to all the excellent people out there already.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So let's talk a little bit of punk rock. I know that it's been a long time passion for you, so much so that, like I said, you did a paper on it. Um, Tell me about how you got interested in punk rock. I'm curious to know, was there a certain band that was just like, oh my God, this is it? Just give me a little flavor of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is just always in my DNA, and I sort of like put this back to my sort of like parents because they'll probably sort of like counteract this this argument, but they're both very liberal parents. Dad definitely had sort of like punk mentalities and used to hang around the King's Road in London in the mid to the late seventies and sort of like so
Yeah,
forth. But they always encouraged me to do what I wanted to do. Sort of like never stepped in. They didn't get stressed out when I started to dye my hair like pink and blue when I was at like school and bits and pieces like that. And I think a lot of it was like when I first worked out how to use their record player, and I could play my dad's like Bowie LPs and the Who, and things like that. My mum was into sort of like bands like the Human League, which I thought were quite different from sort of the music that was coming out at the moment. So
sure.
it was this whole sort of like music thing, but definitely I think it was always been in my DNA from my parents because I to me they're very alternative people, and we're always on the move in our childhood. So I think that's basically where it's brought from. And as time went on, and I could sort of like pick up albums. Like I think I like one of the first albums I like came across was like Buzzcocks' first
Yeah,
album, another music in a different kitchen, and God, I loved songs like Fast Cars and What Do I Get, and well, I liked the Pistols at the time. The music, the Buzzcocks stuff, just was a bit more tuneful and a bit more sort of like lyric based, and
yeah,
I just sort of I just love that stuff. I think the first CD I bought was "I've Got My Mind Set on You" by George Harrison, which is ironic because I can't stand the Beatles, but I think that was the only like glitch in my childhood. And that comment probably won't go down well, but it is what it is. I think the big moment for me was the '90s. The whole grunge movement. I think everything changed for me in like '93 when the Smashing Pumpkins did a live performance of a really heavily distorted version of Disarm on this UK show called The Word, which was presented by a guy called Terry Christian. and I was just in awe. I was in love with James Ehar. And it's just everything about them on stage. And at
Yeah.
that time, I was learning to play the saxophone. And I think I just went downstairs and said, "I want to swap this. I want a guitar."
Yeah.
Um, and, and then that moment, I was just sort of like buying up any punk rock record I could possibly get my sort of like my hands on. And I'll always remember when um, I'll always remember that as like sort of like being a big, just a complete big turning point. And I think from that moment, I was just on the punk run. I had like spiky hair, got my eyebrow pierced, and I tried to basically just merge that mentality into like everything could possibly do. Sort of like accumulated when I did a master's at university in cultural geography, but I almost used the sort of the guise of cultural geography just so I could shove in a punk element. So
Right.
I used the case study to sort of like track the depoliticalization of punk from the late 70s to the early sort of like 2000s, which didn't really set the world on light, but I was so happy with myself that I managed to put together these two sort of like quite disparate disciplines at the time because it just wasn't sort of like something people were doing. But
Sure.
yeah, I think I've always been quite outspoken. I think probably people I work with could maybe say I'm quite opinionated and sort of like difficult, and I don't sort of like stand for like simple answers and stuff. So yeah, I think definitely stems from my parents, and maybe picking up that like a couple of Bowie LPs when I was like maybe I don't know around 6 or 7, and then
Yeah.
it was it was day from there. I remember my dad always used to tell me a story how he was at the Isle of Wight festival in the 70s, and it was just it sounded like living in that late 70s in the UK around London was just such a melting point of alternative lifestyles that it just sounded amazing. So yeah, that's pretty much. But yeah, I blame my parents.
All right, so I have a quick anecdote and then a question. So, in the '80s, for me, I was a metalhead first, playing in a Slayer style thrash metal band with my brother. But in high
Nice.
school, there was a gutter punk who lived down the street. His name was John, really good guy, and he's like, I don't know why you listen to that crap. He said, why don't you come over after school? I got some records that I want you to hear. And so I went over, and he had stuff like GBH, Subhumans, Crass, Discharge, and it was like, whoa, okay, it like totally changed my orientation, and I really kind of rapidly moved from metal to more punk in terms of my interests. And so my question is, now those are all UK, mostly UK bands. Who has a better tradition in punk rock? Is it the UK? Or is
Oh,
it the US, like New York with the Ramones, West Coast with Black Flag? Where is it at?
yeah, that's a really tough question. I mean, I think I'd automatically have to default to the UK, but maybe that's only because I think on both sides. I think I think like in the 90s, all the good stuff was coming out of the US, like
Right,
100%. And the only way to really access and also to access a lot of the bands was like being like through illegal file sharing sites like Audio Galaxy and stuff like that. I mean, it's like great because you could speak to each other. You could ask someone in, I don't know, Seattle what they were listening to get an idea of what new grunge bands were like coming out, or
right,
someone in sort of like Portland to see what sort of like West Coast punk bands were kicking around because there was just no access to that in the UK, and that was sort of the best way to find them. I
right.
think the UK definitely had a resurgence in the 2000s. And I think I started listening to a lot more punk stuff then. and now I've flipped back because the creativity seems to be totally back in the US. So it's almost working on this 10-year cycle pattern, and I'm guessing it's because they learn off each other, or US bands and UK bands will like tour together, and that sort of like
Yeah.
creates a sort of like bigger a melting pot. But
Yeah.
yeah, for me, I think like the '70s punk bands were definitely like stuff like the Buzzcocks were. I think they were my types of favourites. Moving into the '80s, definitely the likes of Black Flags were beating anything else was in the UK, because I think by that time the UK was more on the post-punk
Right.
type of things, and things had settled down with like sort of like that type of thing. So yeah, it's a very political question, but hopefully
All right.
I answered that in a smooth
Yeah, for
way.
sure, for sure. We could talk it over a pint sometime when we get together.
Yes.
That's definitely want to take us a couple hours. Okay, so let's get back to research and insights. Um, Very interested, about you leaving YouGov and starting your own thing, seeing that opportunity as you sort of look out into the future. And we've talked about how much change there's been. What does that future look like? Is there anything you can sort of pinpoint?
Yeah. So I mean, there's so much stuff happening. And I'll leave AI out of it for this, just because it's probably been touched up on a lot. But there's sort of like three things that like see as interesting things that are coming sort of further down the line, or things that are happening now. I think the first one is, I think there'll be like this big movement towards like less is more. I think the days of like people commissioning huge like nat rep studies are going to sort of like slowly fall away. Um, and I think this then will cause a challenge for like big agencies with like big panels, because they are very difficult to maintain. They're sort of expensive. There's the whole sort of like conversation around fraud, and I sort of see this future where I know panel providers are working on lower numbers, like say 10,000 people, but they have a larger amount of long tail data sort of like around them, and they can be better connected to like government ID to sort of like make sure the entire thing is like flawed. Because one thing I do see is that, did have been seen, is like I think clients would rather speak to 50 well sampled um, people that they really want to like speak to on a more succinct set of like topics or sort of like questions. Whether those interviews are slightly longer, I can sort of like see that trend going, and then maybe people are paid more for their sort of like interaction. But
Sure.
I think they'll get to a point where there's a lot more value out of giving the right questions to a smaller amount of people to get a more sort of like a robust sort of like output out of it. And I think that would be a big challenge for a number of sort of like panel providers out there trying to sort of like navigate that. In conjunction with that, I think one topic that's sort of like not really talked about much is like maybe the potential impact of like Web 3.0 and like market research, because everything is so centralized at the moment. Everything basically like users are like under the banner of someone else's privacy policy, someone else's like data collection regime.
Right.
um, and it's just it has to ask the question, like sort of like how much insight is basically trapped behind all these sort of like centralized sort of like gardens, that you're speaking to someone but you actually know a very limited like amount about them, or you can't get to the right sort of like people. So I could definitely see a future where everything becomes a lot more decentralized, and it's a lot of it's like blockchain based, and I think a lot of it can take influence from the crypto world, where I mean sort of like the security, like the privacy, and then that's just by nature that'll take away any like sort of like questions around sort of survey fraud, where sort of like current systems are so easy for like to people to sort of like get into. But I do believe more decentralized models will just massively increase the different types of people you can speak to, whether that's from a diversity like point of view, or being able to speak to 100 people that like this sort of like niche band or do sort of like X, Y, and Z, but also like unearthing all the sort of the additional stuff behind people, rather than it being sort of that being controlled by, well, this person comes from this sample provider, but they've only been given 20 profiling questions. And I think that is something that definitely sort of like people will move away from. I think the third big thing I see happening is people starting to take market research in house.
Yeah.
I think Mike Stevens from Insights Platform posted up, I think in the last year, like an updated version of the ResTech landscape. And I think that was probably only touching the surface, but there's just so many things out there that people can like bring in house. It's crazy basically. And if the punk ethic was like, this is a chord, this is another chord, now go and form a band, then all agencies and brands can basically like pick and choose the best pieces of res tech that work for them, and just basically like take it into their worlds. And I think that's a big risk that is coming for a lot of people, because it's obviously going to eat away at certain people's like revenues and so forth. But I think there'll be much more of a confidence that, because the res tech space has increased so much, that people will start to be able to take stuff inside. And it's not only like, it wouldn't just be for market researchers, right? I mean, other teams would be able to use these platforms, people who work in like analytics or people who work in marketing. And I think the
Sure.
interesting thing about the res tech explosion is that maybe it isn't sort of reserved for market researchers only. It's for sort of like everyone. So yeah, they're my three things. AI obviously is a huge thing, but I thought I'd sort of avoid that by sort of like looking at sort of like, I don't know, three other things which I think are probably more important in time, because like AI is something that isn't going to go away. Um, but yeah, it's definitely had a big impact on the industry.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Excellent. All right. So, question for you, big broad question. Just curious to know, as you, I know you split your time a little bit between the UK and Greece, right, and elsewhere.
Correct?
Um, I'm interested to know, as you have some downtime and you're consuming media, as we all do, what media are you turning to for insight, inspiration, or enjoyment?
Yeah, this is another. I think this is another a tough one. I mean, if I'm honest, I find little enlightenment in sort of like modern media today. I'm not very good at signing up to newsletter lists or bits and pieces like that, because I just haven't found any of that really exciting. I'll always double check in on industry news as a more functional part, but I think the things that I look for in inspiration, or just, I mean, definitely music, but I'll always go back to things like, I'm a big fan of Jack Kerouac books. So, like, books like
Yeah.
On the Road is essentially like the punk Bible for me. But also, there's so much like life wisdom in those types of books that you can use in sort of like your commercial and sort of like business practices, and like Alfred Hitchcock films, and so forth. Sort of like quite set in my ways. I do love reading. I need to start reading more books, but I'll always just go back to Jack Kerouac books for some reason, just because I think every time you reread them, you see something different in them. I think they're so well written, from the fact that sort of like he knew that you're always going to find something different in his books that will just give you a bit of a positive boost for the day, or something that just makes you think, oh yeah, maybe I could like approach something like that. And it's the same for life as well, and sort of like so forth. Digital media, yeah, it's a bit tricky. I've become a bit dismayed with the internet. Like in the early days, the internet was great. You search for something, you'd get back what you wanted. You could easily like connect with like-minded people, through sort of like different systems. And just the nature of the beast now is just you only get to see what advertisers basically want you to see. So it's very difficult to know what the truth or like find these sort of smaller type
Yeah.
sort of like bits and pieces. There's one website I do love. I think it's US based called Brooklyn Vegan. They're very good at recommending obscure new
Yep.
bands and sort of like so forth. So if I had to choose one, I got no idea who the people are that sort of like run it, but I find that a really good website. But yeah, I mean, in my teens, I always used to read Kerrang and Metal Hammer, but they've just become too commercial now that
Yeah.
you just can't sort of like pick them up basically. So YouTube music algorithms are rubbish because I was listening to like Six Pack by Black Flag the other day, and then like two songs down on my radio queue, like a Taylor Swift song came in, and it's just like, yeah, wow. I mean, guys, if you like even looked at what was in my playlist, that artist should like never be anywhere near my sort of like eardrums, basically. So yeah. So yeah, I think that's it. But music, definitely. I mean, there's not a day when I'm not listening to music for like 6 or 8 hours, and I think that's my definitely my key driver of key inspiration. Is when you're down, it gives you a good sort of like boost. It's great for running. Gives you good thinking time. Different artists have different views on the world, which you can take into your learnings, and I take that into my work. So yeah, I think music definitely has to be right at the top, just because there's so much you can take from it, and it just gives so much.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Now you've breached the topic, so I think you know what question is coming. Graham, I'm going to pin you down on this one. It's the toughest question of the bunch, I am sure. So let's say, Graham, you're stranded on a desert island, right? You have three albums of your choosing to keep you company for the rest of your days. I'm super curious to know what those three albums are.
Right, okay, let's do this. So number number one, number one is definitely "Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness" by the Smashing Pumpkins,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it was the last time I went to a record store, or maybe it wasn't. It was the only time I've been to a record store and I've queued outside. The album was released on my 16th birthday, and I remember queuing up outside this amazing independent record store called Richards Records, and I'd earned enough money through random jobs, paper rounds, to literally like buy every single format of it I could get on. But that album has just been with me sort of like emotionally throughout my sort of like whole life. And as a desert islandist, there's just so much going on across um, those two LPs. There's like heavy, there's aggressive stuff, there's like slow stuff, there's these like huge sort of like prog rock esque type sort of like anthems that
yeah.
if I was going to take one album with me to ensure sort of like variety, um, I think that would definitely sort of like be the one. And it's been a band I've seen many times, spent a lot of money on, but yeah, there's something very special about that album when it came out in my teens, and it just completely connected with me, and still does today. So that'd be definitely be my number one.
Cool, cool. And number two and three?
Number two, I had some tricky with, because I'm a huge Midwest emo post-hardcore fan. So Shudder to Think, Fugazi, Texas Is the Reason, sort of like all
Yeah.
these like great labels like Saddle Creek. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. But I think the one album that really impacted me was Domestica by Cursive. Um,
Okay.
it's such a great storytelling sort of like album. If I was going to take one thing away on a desert island, it's almost like it's a great bedtime story, and it's such a great concept album. And Tim Kasher is such an amazing sort of like songwriter, but I love the guitar work on it. It's like really edgy. The lyrics are really good, and I sort of love all the stuff. love all the stuff they've done. I did have one honourable mention that I was going to pick in second place, and that would have been In Casino Out by At the Drive-In, because I think that was another sort of like
Yeah.
seminal album that came into our life in the, I think, what, 96, around 95, something like that, because similar types of style, but when that came out, I was just like, wow, these guys have like literally changed everything, like post-hardcore, sort of like new wave, sort of like punk.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the 90s was just huge. But yeah, I thought I'd squeeze in a quick honourable mention there for that one.
Okay. Okay. Cursive is I have not listened to that record, so I'll cue that one up after we're done chatting. So all right, we got one
It's
more.
good. Yeah, so the third one, I, I there's literally so many to choose on because I think I've probably got like 5,000 albums on CD or like bits and pieces like that. But if I'm thinking more punk, and it's probably a bit of a left field choice, but it's 60 Second Wipeout by a band called Atari Teenage Riot from sort of like Germany. That's like led by Alec Empire. Um, it used to be a woman in it called Helen Elias, and then Nick Endo, and sort of like bits and pieces. But I remember on YouTube, I think sort of towards the end of the 90s, because I used to be into drum and bass in a bit in my sort of like early teens. And
Sure.
when I first heard that album, it's just like it just punches you in the face, and like they're so political and so forthright, and they mix this like these punky guitars with this like white noise, drum and bass, techno, and Nick Endo's screams are just amazing. They would literally send like sort of like shivers down my spine. And I remember seeing that they did a gig on an open top bus in Berlin around the late 90s for May Day, and everyone was like writing and so forth. And it was just like, wow, they've created something and they're really going for it, and they're using their voice, and they no, it's basically sort of like digital hardcore, but it's just such a great album. They've mixed all these different things together, sort of it, like into it. And I was lucky enough to see. I think the last time they played the UK was in around '99 at Brixton Academy, and they just come off like a year or two touring the album, and they were so burnt out, and you could tell that there was big problems in the band, drugs and sort of like all sorts. And they were supporting Nine Inch Nails, but they didn't actually get around to playing any songs. They just played a wall of white noise for half an hour and then left the stage. And everyone was standing there just gobsmacked because people were like, "Is that what they do? Is that what their sets are like and stuff like that?" But it wasn't. They were just so burnt out. But yeah, if I was on a desert island, I'd need to be doing some exercise and sort of keeping fit. And I think that album is definitely be perfect for that. I think the honorary album I'd add into that is Pinkerton by Weezer, because I think that's
Oh,
also
interesting.
like
Yeah.
a big album. I love bands that do their poppy stuff as the first album, then they have the tricky second one, like Nirvana with In Utero,
Sure.
Bush with Razorblade Suitcase. Yeah, Weezer killed it with that. They're like, they made this like probably one of the best pop rock records of all time, and then they just went weird and delivered this like amazing sort of like really grungy, punky sort of like alternative. Like, yeah, we're just going to release this
Yeah.
crazy record. So, but yeah, Atari Teenage Riot just beat them because they had a bit more punk ethic. So that's why they got into number three.
Yeah, awesome. It's a new one for me, so I definitely have some new ones to listen to. And interesting you mentioned Weezer. I think the neat thing about them is they have kind of the best of both worlds, right? So they've got
Yes,
living off the royalties of these huge songs that they came out with, but then they have this extremely loyal, rabid fan base that is into all the records that they made afterward, which is usually not the case for bands that hit it big like they did. So it's kind of a cool thing.
yeah. So I think that's my three. I feel guilty that I should have mentioned a huge amount of like other bands, but
It's
I guess we can
hard
do
to
that
pick
another
out.
time, Matt. We can do that
Well,
another time.
yeah, we'll have to save that somewhere at some point, sometime. You and me at a pub with a pint, and we'll be there for hours, and we'll beat this stuff up
Yeah,
a little bit. So,
days possibly.
yes, that's right. Excellent. All right, Graham. It's been such a great chat. Just scratching the surface. Looking forward to more great chats. So let's talk soon again. Hopefully sometime in person. But rock and roll.
Rock and roll indeed.